My 16-inch MacBook Pro setup consists of this laptop and the studio display. Altogether, that cost me £5,198. So, after nearly half a year of using this as my main production machine, was that massive investment worth it? So I avoided calling this video a long-term review of the 16-inch MacBook Pro simply because I think 5 or 6 months-ish isn't really long enough to give you that full, rounded opinion of what this laptop is like to live with for a long time. But over that period, it has sat at the heart of my production process for this brand. Also, this wasn't a cheap computer. It cost nearly £3,700, so it was a massive investment for my business. And I know there are lots of people out there working out whether or not to make that same investment in their business, their hobby, or just because they want this 16-inch MacBook Pro. So for me, this laptop has two main objectives. The first one is to be the best video editing rig I've ever used, and the second one is to be a potential long-termer. So having used this every single day over the last 5 or 6 months, this is what I've learned. This video is sponsored by the wonderful team at MacPaw. Firstly, go and check out Setup. It is this wonderful service where for just $9.99 a month, you get access to loads of incredible apps. It's genuinely unbelievable how many amazing apps are within that $9.99 subscription. I use it. I know loads of people who absolutely love it. Go and check it out. It is absolutely wonderful. But more importantly, and if you're not aware, MacPaw are based in the heart of Ukraine in Kiev. And as you'd guess, they are going through an incredibly challenging situation at the moment. Despite that, MacPaw has remained fully active as a business, supporting its customers, still developing wonderful software, and doing an awful lot to support the people of Ukraine. So although this video is sponsored by MacPaw, I will not be accepting any form of payment. And if you'd like to support them yourself or just check out what they're doing as part of the effort to help the Ukrainian people, just click the link in my description. So my 16-inch MacBook Pro has a very defined role in this studio. It spends probably 95% of its time in Final Cut Pro. I do some audio editing on here, mainly the 8 or 16 podcast, which I'll link to in the description. I do want to get back into music production this year at some stage, so I'll start to use things like Logic Pro a bit more, but it really is just a video editing rig. And that's mainly why I went for the M1 Max chip over the M1 Pro chip, because I wanted to get the maxed out graphics cores and just see how that benefited video editing. And I'm really glad I did that, because this laptop is the fastest machine I've ever had for Final Cut Pro, and I've never had so much performance headroom. I have done some tests in previous videos. I'll link above to my full review of this laptop so you can check them out. But if you know me, you know that I don't do benchmarks, and I'm far more interested in how these things feel on a day-to-day basis. And when it comes to the key things that matters as a video editor, rendering and exporting, it is the fastest thing, again, I've ever used. It never drops frames. The footage from this camera, which is a Sony FX3, it's 4K, 10-bit 422 colour. It's pretty chunky footage. It is smooth as butter on this thing. And for the first time ever, I can actually edit video with the high quality mode set on, which I never used to do. The only thing I would say is that it is almost too fast for Final Cut Pro. If you're a Final Cut Pro user, you're going to know exactly what I'm referring to now. So when you're playing your footage back on Final Cut Pro and you start scrolling through the timeline, Final Cut Pro, for love nor money, will not redraw the audio waveform or the clip preview. I'll show you some B-roll now so you can see what this looks like, but basically, as you scrub through, you have to stop playback to let Final Cut Pro redraw those audio waveforms and the clips. It's really annoying, to the point where it's become muscle memory for me to stop playback, wait for it to load, and then continue. I thought that was down to my Mac Mini, the M1 Mac Mini behind me. I thought it was just a little bit too much for that computer. Turns out, no, it's all down to Final Cut Pro. Apple, please fix that. So a huge tick in terms of straight line performance for this laptop when it comes to video editing in Final Cut Pro. That said, it does reveal that Final Cut Pro needs some fixing. Now, whenever I mention the fact that this is too big, too heavy, too thick, and too unwieldy to carry around all day, people tell me to go to the gym. But I don't care. This thing is really heavy. Trust me, it's just a heavy laptop. There's no two ways about it. You know, we can get facetious about it and say, well, you know, go to the gym and work out a bit more. I'm not suggesting this is heavier than my car, but it's heavy for a laptop. And this presents two issues. The first one is when you sling this under your arm like this, I have to be careful, you're very conscious that you're holding a heavy laptop, and any inadvertent twist of the wrist, or if you move around too quickly, you could drop a very expensive laptop. The second issue with its size and weight is the fact that I need to put it into something to get it here. And I have two options with this. The first one is the brilliant Waterfield Designs Tech Folio Brief. I made a video about that, which I'll link to above. The second option, and the one that gives me the biggest worry with this laptop, is the Neo Smart Neo, let me get this right, Neo Urban, which is a fantastic backpack. I'll link to it in the description. But as you can see, it's got this great big pouch in the back for the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Perfect fit, nicely felt lined, no problem at all, you'd think. However, I'm always conscious when this laptop is in here that something could go wrong with it. The reason for that is that I've heard some horror stories about people bending their MacBook Pros. And this happens obviously completely inadvertently when a big laptop is placed in your backpack and things push against it, or just the weight and kind of the bend in your back over time causes issues with the structure of the laptop. Now, I might be worrying way too much about this. I would guess that the structure and the build quality of this MacBook Pro, which is fantastic by the way, should prevent that kind of thing from happening, but I still worry about it. And I've never worried about the M1 MacBook Air in the same way. I think if I had the 14-inch version of this laptop, I don't think I'd worry about that in the same way. But because this is so big, such a huge footprint, I just worry about it in that bag. It's also why I don't take this to coffee shops and why I am desperately awaiting the arrival of Final Cut Pro on the iPad Pro. So at the start of this video, I mentioned that the entire cost of this MacBook Pro setup was £5,198. You might be wondering how I got to that figure, and the reason's quite simple. Very recently, I purchased the Studio display. Now, I made a video about that very recently, which I'll link to above. Spoiler, it is just too expensive. That's the biggest issue with it. It's a lovely display, don't get me wrong. You might wonder in that case why I bought it, obviously partly for this channel to review it, but I did buy it with the intention of keeping it, which is what I'm going to do. And the reason for that, as much as I love the big 16-inch screen on this, which is fantastic for video editing at home, whenever I came into this big studio space, it just felt a bit lost. And what I really wanted was a Retina, really sharp, Apple-like display for this studio. That is what Apple released in March, and we'll put all of the pricing and the failings of it to one side. It has given me that big screen that I was absolutely desperate for in this space. I do miss ProMotion a little bit on the Studio display, just because on here, it does make the timeline very, very smooth when you're scrolling through Final Cut Pro, but that's a minor gripe really. So yes, the combination of this MacBook Pro and the Studio display is rather expensive, but my hope is that it will last me quite a long time. Also, there's a lot to be said for the convenience of just rocking up with this MacBook Pro, placing it on the desk, plugging in one cable between this and the Studio display, and that's all you need. It feeds this laptop power, it feeds the image to the display. It's really super convenient. Now, if you know me, you'll know that I'm far more interested in convenience features rather than specs and benchmarks, and I'm happy to report that the 16-inch MacBook Pro has two convenience features which are just absolutely unbeatable. The first one is battery life, which is astonishing. I've spoken about this quite a lot, so forgive me, but it's worth repeating because I still cannot get over how much battery life I get out of this thing. Firstly, the in-use time is absolutely stunning. Quite often I'll be working on a video and completely forget that it hasn't been plugged in for 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours. That low battery warning thing that you get in macOS is such a rare sight. It just completely changes your relationship with this computer. The second thing is the speakers. Now, I'm not part of the crowd who will tell you that the MacBook Pro speakers will replace your hi-fi, because they won't. They're not that good. But when it comes to comparing them against other laptop speakers, they are superb. And more importantly, for me, for a video editor who basically works with the exact same sound setup for most of his videos, so the mic doesn't change, the environment doesn't change, I don't change really. I'm working with the same audio, so I pretty much know what to do with it when it comes to editing. And because of that, I'm rarely using headphones to monitor my audio for these videos these days. I pretty much just rely on the speakers in this laptop. Now, I wouldn't recommend using these as your single source of truth for your audio production. I've spent many hours getting my audio right just through headphones and monitor speakers. But once you've done that, if you're happy with the sound, and like I say, your environment and the sound, the kit that you're using doesn't change, then these are perfectly adequate, perfectly good to just use rather than headphones. And those two convenience factors, battery life and the quality of the speakers, make this such an enjoyable and hassle-free laptop to use. I think we've officially entered the world of diminishing returns with Macs these days. I think Apple Silicon has revolutionized and basically democratized power for normal users. And I'd count myself firmly in that bracket. I don't really need all the power that this laptop has. Could I have got away with the M1 Pro rather than the M1 Max? Absolutely. But that should hopefully save you some money, because if you're thinking about buying the 16-inch MacBook Pro, trust me, you will know if you need the absolute specced out, maxed out version, because your work, you'll just know that it's that intensive. If you're not sure, you don't need it to be maxed out. Trust me. That's the biggest thing I've learned about the M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro since I got it last year. I just can't put all of this power to use. But that's actually really good news for you and for me in the future, because you don't need to spend any more than you need to spend on these laptops. And that has never really been the case with Macs. I think my interest in this 16-inch MacBook Pro is pretty aspirational. It's probably why you're watching this video, to be fair. It's a little bit like your mate who's got a very expensive, really high performance car giving you the keys. You feel a little bit naughty using it because you know that you can't put it to use. So if you've got the budget and desire to own something as maxed out as this 16-inch MacBook Pro, the M1 Max version, go for it. You will be so happy with your purchase and it will last you many, many years. If, on the other hand, you'd rather just admire this kind of stuff from afar on channels like mine, then save yourself some money and get the base model, or just get the one that you can afford. Don't spend too much. However, if you are still confused between the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro, I have made a video about that as well, so keep watching for a link to that video. But until next time, thank you as always for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.